2026, and we have, of course, another woman achiever, of course, and someone who is an inspiration to countless other women as well across the country. I'm, of course, talking about former Union Minister Srimati Smriti Irani ji, who's now amidst us. We are very, very happy to have you return to the We Women Want Conclave stage. We've had you here before, ma'am, as chief guest, and we're very privileged and grateful that you have chosen to come back once again to our 2026 edition for our next session, which of course is aptly titled Women-Led Development. I'm going to hand over the floor to Editor-in-Chief of NewsX, Rishabh Gulati. Could we have a round of applause, please, for the lady who has joined us on stage for this next session?
Yeah, Uday, from previous experience, I know this, both in the audience here and the people who are watching on television back home, always a popular session. Smriti ji, we've had these conversations now for several years. We come back year after year. It's an evolution for us on this podium, and it's an evolution that's happening in society as well. So I want to ask you, in this podium, when we're discussing women, you've been recently posting on social media about being a mother and about when a mom's job is done. It's a very interesting post. I'm sure some people have already seen it, but can you describe that, to parents and others out there? What was the message? What was your thought?
I think that the question posed to me was about working mothers and how do working mothers balance between their personal and their professional commitments. The raw truth is that a mother's job is truly done when the child doesn't need the mother anymore. A child needs a mother to nourish. A child needs a mother to nurture. A child needs a mother so that they are rooted, but they also have very strong wings to fly. I think that the process of establishing that value system in the child is a very tedious process. It is not a process that endears a mother to a child, especially when the child has different perspectives. But once the child genuinely grows strong wings to fly, sometimes they do look back and give thanks for the strong value system a mother instills. And sometimes they're so busy flying that they never have the time to come back home. So it's a bittersweet tragedy of being a mother. It is possibly the only relationship on planet Earth that doesn't cling to a human being, but in fact endeavors so that the human being is so independent that the person is not needed anymore. So you spend half your life building a life that doesn't need you in the other half.
As a parent...
So I did have a lot of fathers complain.
I know, as a parent and the father of a 4-year-old girl, I totally relate. It was emotive because you're thinking that, yes, that's the next...
So to the fathers of daughters, I always... this is something that possibly is a Punjabi way of talking about it. We always say, do the best that you can for your daughter, because you never know what challenges awaits her as she matures and goes out in the world. True. So the best thing a father to a daughter can do is indulge her.
True that. So as a mother, ma'am, to Gen Z children, including a 22-year-old Gen Z daughter, heading out into this big and beautiful and sometimes tough world, what advice do you give her now?
Don't give advice to people. That has been my advice to everybody. Because everybody comes with different circumstances, capacities. Everybody comes with a different set of challenges. Everybody has a different mind frame. To presume that two human beings will think alike, respond alike, is to not recognize the divergence that we have today in our society. Our generation possibly has seen parenting which is distinct from new age parents, where harsh love was the pure definition of love. Today, gentle parenting is the in thing. So I think that given that every generation responds to its circumstances, given its own capacities and resources, the only thing that you can give to somebody is unconditional love and support, especially if it's your child.
That's totally relatable. If we look forward to us as a country and we have a national vision and a mission which is aiming to 100 years, 2047, Mission Viksit Bharat, it is a truism to say that end goal which will be inherited by this Gen Z, which is in their 20s and beyond.
I think that is to be myopic in your perspective. Should a nation only be inherited by one generation? What of the other 80% of the population that may come to a crossroads of life? Do they not deserve the same benefits of such a country which is resilient, which is resourceful, which is also energetic about its future, but it's mindful of its past? To say that the future only belongs to one subset in an age bracket is to deny that right to every other citizen, a right that is enshrined in our constitution. I think that in a country where we've seen a lot of politics done on the basis of religion and caste, ageism is becoming the new silo to divide society on. To say that you will be redundant just because you cross a particular decadal threshold is again seeding in, maybe formally, maybe informally, psychologically a state of mind where we deny fellow citizens the respect that they deserve just for being citizens of this country. So should I say 2047 doesn't belong to 30-year-old women, 40-year-old women, 50 or 60-year-old women? That 2047 doesn't belong to men who will be 50 then? That will be because youth is something which is not static or stagnant. It is a age bracket that leaves all of us. So can we be ageist now? As women, we have faced a world where there was a lot of misogyny, but there was misogyny that was met with a lot of silence. Today, your podium and the opening remarks were done by 3 men on a topic of breast cancer. Could you have imagined it a decade and a half ago? Or a decade ago? You couldn't have. So can we now deny fellow citizens the rights, the aspirations, the dreams of a Viksit Bharat just because they don't fit into the age bracket of 18 to 20, or for that matter 18 to 30?
Made a powerful point. There is a seminal moment which is much closer by. 33% reservation for women in parliament. We know it's been enacted by law. It has to be notified, and we are going through a parliamentary process through that. In terms of how iconic this would be and what it would fundamentally change in the years to come, where do you see that path?
I think what Prime Minister Modi has done is brought issues of women at the very fulcrum of governance. If you look at our country 12 years ago, was there ever a conversation in our country about building toilets for women? From the ramparts of the Red Fort, did we ever have a Prime Minister talk about providing sanitary napkins for women across the country? We did not. Today, it seems like a way of life. But 12 years ago, was there any politician talking about building financial opportunities for women, ensuring, as the LG said right now in the opening remarks, was there ever a Prime Minister that actively processed or pursued permanent commission for women in the armed forces? So today these are issues which are a given. But should we forget where we began from 12 years ago? Today political parties will say yes, women as voters are to be fundamentally looked at as a separate voting bloc. They have certain demands, they have certain aspirations, which if not politically addressed, that political organization will not get the support of women across the country. That being said, was this a reality about Indian politics a decade and a half ago? It was not. There was a presumption a decade and a half ago that women will vote predominantly as families, or especially the men in the family would decide. To have that whole system now today change and have an outlook change, I think is an issue that we should not forget. Secondly, today you began your program predominantly on the issue of women's health and the breast cancer technicians and doctors that you have cheered for on this stage, and very rightfully so, given thanks for their contribution. The largest health program on planet Earth has been currently run in India called Ayushman Bharat. But Rishabh, if you look at the very detailed numbers that are publicly available today, close to 25 crore screenings have happened across the country for cancer of the breast and cervix. I think, subject to correction if my data is correct, close to 8 crore cervical cancer screenings have happened. Now, if you ask women today who were maybe reporting on such issues a decade and a half ago, that will you ever see a time in India where a government will facilitate screening of the cervix? free of cost across 20,000 hospitals, and women will voluntarily go leverage that government policy and receive that benefit. People a decade and a half ago would tell you that this is an issue where there is a societal challenge and women will not speak. So what Ayushman Bharat has done is 25 crore screenings for breast cancer and cervical cancer is not a small number. So the fact that women are reaching out and leveraging this government policy means women always knew what the challenge was with regards to their health. What they lacked were resources. What they lacked was a definite policy framework, which is what Prime Minister Modi's government has provided. And that is a huge shift. It was not a topic that was mainstreamed on any podium a decade and a half ago. Today, you can't do without talking about such issues.
Yeah, so true.
Because a woman ignored is a vote lost.
So you're absolutely right. So the gap we are trying to fill through our foundation is to make it mobile. So the mobile vans actually go village to village, so that women don't have to travel to the nearest center. And like I said, 150,000 screenings have happened. Smriti ji, from everybody sitting here, including myself, or many people who are watching this at home, you probably spent the most amount of time on the ground during the past decade, where this change has really happened. We had last year drone didis and Lakpati didis. Today we had 6 women sarpanches who were coming from all over different states who were talking about the change that is happening. On the ground, when the toilets get made and the Jan Dhan account opens and the micro loans come, or the property gets into the name of the woman in the family, or they get a loan from the various schemes, or the Ayushman Bharat comes into your hand. What is the change that you see in empowering these families?
So research has shown that if you have women who are economically more determined, economically more robust in terms of their own purchasing power or their spend, 40% of what they earn is spent on the education and health of their family. And the 60% that they have is basically spent on their everyday, day-to-day living. But what is fascinating is that an issue such as domestic violence, if you look at crime against women, most of it is done by people that she either knows or within her own community structures. And it has been researched again that women who own property are less susceptible to be victims of domestic violence. And today, you cannot shy away from the fact that over 4 crore homes under the Pradhan Mantri program have been built for women both in urban and rural India, of which it was the direction of the Prime Minister's office that either the house be completely owned by the female beneficiary or the beneficiary ownership should be split 50-50 between the husband and the wife, which means over a decade, you've seen 4 crore homes built for women. So if you talk about what change do you see, when did we ever have such a focused intervention? We spoke about toilets being built, we spoke about bank accounts being opened. Mudra was not a gendered financial intervention. It was an intervention for any Indian who did not have money or collateral who wanted to start a business. Now, out of the 300 million loans that I last checked the data on, 70% of the beneficiaries were women. Now, Rishabh, today it becomes very easy to talk about this number. But imagine, where did these accounts emanate from? Either from the rural or urban poor, or from areas that some people call slums, or from lower middle class families where women are trying to create a niche for themselves. What does that one loan mean? It means that a woman must have sat down, drawn a business plan, gone to a bank, a local branch for that matter, but convinced the bank officer that this is the business need that she has, taken the loan, serviced his back. Because today when you look at the NPAs, and my apologies to the gentleman in the room, the NPAs of women own such credit is less as compared to men, 2% as compared to possibly close to 3% on businesses owned by men. So this was not a gendered intervention. However, women took advantage of that as well. Now imagine even something, a loan like given to street hawkers. Last I checked, 6 lakh women took it across the country. there's at least 1 lakh women who took the third round of loans after paying back. That means that financial prudence and fiscal discipline is very inherent to a female in our country, that even a female street hawker knows the discipline of taking the loan and paying it back.
You know, it is statistics which oftentimes we see on television or read about them, but experiencing it on the ground to see the life that has changed.
So next time you see a female street hawker, know that she has the financial discipline and she has enough financial value for the taxpayers' money to take that support from the government and pay back.
Ma'am, you know, this morning we had a gentleman called Navnidhi Sharma. His daughter Tusha Sharma, as you might have heard, was found dead in her marital home. Last year we had Ratna Devnath, whose daughter, you know, was brutally gang raped in Arjikar and killed. She's now an MLA in the state of Bengal. We had Asha Devi, Nirbhaya's mother, in Delhi. We're still experiencing things that shake us to the core periodically. What can we still do?
There was a time where the discussion around women's emancipation and protection for women brought forth one agenda. There was conversation around the fact that if only people were better educated, such crimes would not happen. There was a presumption that such crimes will happen maybe in communities where education and the very sense of citizenship, the very sense of belief in the rule of law, if it's absent, then such incidents occur. I think the dichotomy, Rishabh, is that these cases that you've mentioned have all had people who've had at least a modicum or gone beyond a threshold of education. So if education cannot fix it, what can? It is a societal malaise. From an administrative point of view, I've had the privilege of seeing the government set up 1,064 fast-track courts. But the reality is that the government had to set up 1,064 fast-track courts. From a perspective of administration, I have seen, and I was the minister in charge when the Prime Minister had brought to every district in our country one-stop centers where women got short stay homes, medical, legal support, police support if they were victims of crime. But the reality is that such one-stop centers were missing for at least 70 years of our independence. But more so, these were needed. That research will show, and this is a research which is a tad bit old, but I will still refer to it, that female feticide in a place like South Mumbai was higher than rural Maharashtra. How is that possible? So while administratively I have seen the government step up, and now let me switch to private sector. We say that the legislation today allows for women to have a very participative, productive role in boards across companies. But what stops corporate India from having the equal number of women on a board as compared to the equal number of men? Nothing. We talk about women who are labor at construction sites. But are those construction sites not part of formal corporate India? They are. Many of them are listed companies. So what stops such companies from ensuring that the female worker on their side is equally paid and has received the protection of formalization of jobs? So while I've seen the government step up, I think there are many parts of our society which has stepped up. Corporate India has stepped up. But the gap still exists which we need to collectively fill.
It's a call to conscience. I just want to touch upon one broad subject because we had a beautiful and really interesting conversation 1 year ago on this because we were seeing this world of AI emerging around us. And you presented a very, very, very interesting, eye-opening almost, aha moment, that if all of our artificial intelligence is trained on all that is on the internet, the artificial intelligence by itself will be trained on a history of misogynism and will therefore probably turn into that. 1 year later, Smriti ji,
things haven't changed.
Things haven't changed.
Because you have a whole continent which is missing, which is not connected to the internet. You have close to 1.8 billion people that are not connected to the internet. They are linguistically very diverse. However, if the internet is scraped through to build the foundational value systems of the AI structure that we spoke about last year, that means 1.8 billion people, their culture, their language, their social structures are all missing. We spoke last year about how women and their public premise, their financial capacity, their financial history, their health history is missing. As an example, and I'll reiterate what I said last year, that in automobile companies, when you do safety tests using AI, they consider the male physical form and do not consider the female physical form, which means that the number of accidents on the female physical form, the probability goes up by 40%. And they do not even consider what happens if a pregnant female is driving in such a situation. AI doesn't consider it. But what is shocking now is that most of the money that has gone to the West and predominantly the US to build the AI giants, today, a year later, Rishabh, I think Hindi में एक शब्द है हास्यास्पद. हास्यास्पद ये है कि if you look at American businesses which were supposed to flourish on AI, which is sovereignly built, 46% of American businesses now have moved to Chinese AI models. So AI is changing its nature of business with every passing year. But the thing that is stagnant is still, are women being left out? That question is still unanswered.
It's an open question, open to research for whoever's watching this telecast. Okay, Smriti ji, before I let you go, I know we're short on time. We missed you last year because you were traveling, because we had Ekta Kapoor here, and we were hoping on a grand reunion because something grand was coming back on our television screens. A year has now elapsed since then, so I have to ask you as a tiny rapid fire question. OG's, Tulsi of 2008 or the new version?
The new one has a very big paycheck, so I'll take the new one.
And
the new one has also captured the OTT market, which is close to 35% of the market. So I'll take this one any day.
Okay, but before we let you go, your husband recently said
Did he?
The world isn't ready for what is yet to come. Can you fill in the blanks? What is building up that we don't know about?
I think he's trying to reflect very humbly so on his own miseries of being my husband.
Well, Smriti ji, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for all the
Pleasure is
time
mine.
and
Thank
for
you for
all
the
the very erudite and sensible points you made. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, former Union Minister.